Welcome to Colonie TV, the governmental educational channel for the town of Colonie.
All right, well, welcome to Meet the Author. My name is Joe Nash. Today we're going to be talking to James Redwood. He teaches down at Albany Law School. He's written an excellent book of short stories here. It's called Love Beneath the Napalm. And last year it won the Notre Dame Review Book Prize. It's published by University of Notre Dame Press. Many of the stories in here were published there, and several were published in some very prestigious literary journals like the Kenyon Review, Tri-Quarterly, Virginia Quarterly Review, Black Warrior Review. So welcome. Thanks for coming.
No, thank you, Joe. I appreciate it.
Now, the stories all take place, well, I shouldn't say they take place. They're about the Vietnam War, the effects of the Vietnam War, both at the time and in the present day, I guess. However, you did not serve. So why don't you start with, you taught English in Vietnam from 72 to 74, then you went back in 75. So this obviously was a genesis for most of these stories. So why don't you just tell us about your experience there?
Well, I was very lucky, Joe, because I had a very high lottery number. So I was exempt from the draft. But after I graduated from college, Vietnam had always been in the news throughout the 60s. I graduated from Oberlin College in 1971. And I had been interested in Vietnam and sort of following the course of events and the war. And so I decided, it took me actually a year to get these plans to come to fruition, but I decided that I would be interested in going over there. Since I had gotten my degree in English, it made sense for me to see if I could teach English. So I wrote to some Vietnamese schools, universities, and English language schools in Saigon and Entail, which was in the Mekong Delta. And I just asked them if I were to come over. I didn't expect them to pay for me, but I asked, if I came over, would you be interested in employing me as a native speaker of English? And I got a positive response from several of those. And so in the fall of 1972, I just took a Pan Am Clipper from San Francisco to Hawaii to Guam to Saigon.
But I guess my question is, what you just wrote them cold? You didn't go through an agency or a international?
No, it was. I mean, I had tried. I'd been interested possibly in the Peace Corps. I was initially going to go to Korea in the Peace Corps, but I decided I'd rather go to Vietnam. So my first option was to ask the Peace Corps, but they said, you got to be crazy for one thing, and the Peace Corps was never in Vietnam. It was just too dangerous. And the only other viable alternative was an agency called IVS, International Voluntary Services. But by 1971, they were pulling out of Vietnam. Okay. And so they weren't hiring anybody else to go back into Vietnam. So that, in essence, made the option.
But I guess my question is, with the war and everything, and you didn't want to join the service, or I say didn't want to, but you didn't because you weren't drafted. And yet you still wanted. I mean, when you think back, what was it? Why did you want to? Well,
I guess because I was 21, 22, and 21-year-olds do stupid things. Perhaps. I mean, maybe that's the best way of doing it. It was just something that I had been following since 1963. And, I didn't know what to do after college. Did I want to go to graduate school or law school ultimately? I wasn't ready at that time. And so I felt it would also be an opportunity for me to do something that might contribute.
And what did the job, I don't know if you got paid, but what did it entail in teaching English? What were the people like? Was it, the war was still going on then?
The war was still going on, but I was in Saigon, and so with the exception of times like the Tet Offensive in January and February 1968, and then Mini Tet in May of 68, Saigon was relatively calm. I mean,
it was pretty,
not all the time, but
it was pretty safe, relatively.
Well, relatively speaking, and so teaching was very interesting because I taught all levels. I actually, in order to make a go of it, you couldn't teach just at one school because they didn't give you enough hours or enough money to really to allow you to support yourself. So I started out with the Vietnamese Language School, which had been started by a couple of brothers who had studied in the U.S. and whose English was very good. And that was just kids of all ages and adults. This was basically, they just wanted to learn the English language. Then I started teaching a class actually of college students, but the class was actually at La Santabert High School in downtown Saigon. But they were college-age kids.
Okay.
And then eventually, the one that I had, I think the longest, was at the Language Center at Ban Han University in Saigon, which was a Buddhist university. And that was, again, college, basically college kids.
Well, your stories are set, some are set during the war, some are set later on. Now, and you were telling me before we started, most of the stories haven't been published. The ones in this book, after 99, 2000, were these stories percolating for 30 years, or?
Well, kind of. I mean, I could kick myself for not having started to write earlier because, you know, I didn't really start writing and creative writing until 1986, fall of 1986, and then started writing about Vietnam in 87. And, you know, it takes a long time to sort of hone your craft, so to speak, or to be able to make a story that works, let's put it that way. And so I started getting these stories published in 93, and then the Virginia Quarterly Review accepted one in 98. I think it was published in the spring of 99, and then several things followed from that.
Okay. Now your stories, I've read 4 or 5 of them. They're really very good. They're most interesting. You cover sort of a wide, I don't want to, is class the right word? You cover sort of all classes, people in the service, people not in the service, all ages and genders.
Well, one of the things that I think makes this collection a little bit different from other collections is actually there are stories that are set way before the American involvement. There's one story that's set at the sort of the end of the Nguyen dynasty, the last dynasty.
I didn't read that one.
In Wales, that's fine. And that's called The Sun Returns. And then there are a couple of stories later on in the book that are actually set during the French occupation of Vietnam. And interestingly enough, involve real historical characters. For example, one of them deals with the visit to Saigon in 1893, I think it is, of Tsarevich Nikolai of Russia, who later became Nicholas Nikolai II, the Tsar who was assassinated, overthrown by Lenin in 1917 and then assassinated. But his father wanted him essentially, I guess, to grow up and sent him on a tour of the Far East. And so he stopped in Saigon and was feted by the Governor General, the French Governor General. And so I wrote a story that's centered around him. I also wrote a story centered around the French composer Camille Saint-Saëns, who visited Vietnam and in 1895, actually. So I think what's different about this story or about this collection is that it's not confined to the American involvement in Vietnam. And then there's one story that's set in Vietnam in 1979, North Vietnam. When the Chinese invaded Vietnam, there was a brief war between China and Vietnam in 1979. Okay. So I tried to sort of cover the range, shall we say. But
well, in the 4 stories that I read, even though it was in passing, the French were mentioned. Do you think, is that an overlooked part of Vietnam's history? I mean, I think everyone thinks, well, the French were there before America, but is that really an overlooked part, do you think?
Well, I think it is here. I've read I read French, and so I've read a lot of works written by French writers that have never been translated into English, which sort of is indicative of the fact that what they write is not necessarily of interest to an American audience. But yeah, I think that the context for our involvement in Vietnam, which essentially lasted in terms of combat from 1961 until 1973 when we pulled out, but ultimately the war ended in 1975. But the French were in Vietnam for about 80 years, or 100 years, really. And I think to understand the Vietnamese and sort of their mentality, I think it's important not simply to look at those 12, 13 years that we were there, but also prior. And even before the French, the Vietnamese had fought off the Chinese, and they were at war with the Chinese for 1,000 years, which is not an epic that I cover in my book.
Well, the other thing that I think is different, I guess you could say, except for the last story, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, all the stories, none of them are from an American's point of view. There's there's no story about an English teacher in Saigon doing.
Well, no, that's correct, Joe. And I think that one of the things that I think is important. First of all, I could not write from a veteran's perspective. I think it would be very presumptuous of me, and almost insulting, because I have not having served. There are a lot of fine writers, Tim O'Brien, Robert Olin Butler, who have written stories and novels that are really centered around the American veteran experience, and others. Just mention those two, but there are a lot of others. So I believe that territory has already been covered, and covered much better than I could. But I do feel that I was fortunate enough to be able to live with Vietnamese families, to work with Vietnamese. I also took part in a social welfare project. I was the only, aside from Dick Hughes, the person who started it, I was the only other American employee. And because I wasn't in the military, I had the great good fortune, I think, to get to know a number of Vietnamese in Saigon in a much more personal way. And so I think what I'm trying to do in the stories is just to bring out their point of view, and try to depict their lives. And again, not simply in the context of when America was there, but also sort of in a historical context of sort of long view.
In the stories that I read, you have, I think the story, the character, one guy works in working for the government, but they're just, even though the war is going on, they're in Saigon, they're just trying to live their life, get through the day, and there's stuff that goes on in the office, and it's just...
Oh yeah, well I mean what's interesting is, whether you're talking about the North Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese, people were trying to live their lives, and they would have the same kind of feelings, kind of thoughts that I think everybody would. They'd get jealous, they'd get hurt, they'd get angry.
And then in the one story, there's a story in there called "The Leader," which is. I don't know if I want to say it's kind of cynical, but he's thinking about, they have this little battle or something, and he's thinking of, because the general died, he's going to be promoted. And he's thinking that, right? I mean,
ambition. Yeah. And
I shouldn't laugh, but it's...
Well, he's an unreliable narrator, too. It's kind of fun to deal with unreliable narrators, because they...
But I mean, you're trying to show people in all their complexity, and and the other thing I think in the 4 stories I read that you really did well, the effects of the war, even decades later. In one of the story, The Stamp Collector, I think it's the 1980s, and is it Mr. Tone, the character? He's living in America, and yet he still sleeps under his cot.
Well, I think, I mean, he's got these habits, not necessarily that the cot would help particularly, but if a rocket comes down, you probably want to have some sort of protection, and so it's sort of a reflex reaction. And I do think that people have these ingrained habits that are based on, in essence, a survival instinct. And one thing about the Vietnamese that is amazing is the Vietnamese are survivors, and so you have this guy who comes over to the U.S. He's working in this 7-Eleven in Glendale, California, and he can't let go of some of these these old habits, because
I mean, in the
that's
same
how
way,
it's coped.
in the same way, a lot of veterans
Yeah.
to come.
Well, I mean, I think that, there's one thing that there are a few things that I would hope the stories convey. One, again, is really to make the Vietnamese center stage, but also to try to portray them in a way that we can relate to and still relate to. And now it's coming up on the 50th anniversary of the beginnings of the, not really the beginnings, because the U.S. was really there in terms of military advisors beginning in 1961, but then the involvement ultimately after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which was in August of 1964, and then the American troops landing in Da Nang in February of 1965. We're coming close to the 50th anniversary of that.
Well, Vietnam, it does have a long history. I think that people sometimes don't realize, because you mentioned earlier, they fought China, way before even the French and everything.
Oh, their major enemy always has been and probably always will be the Chinese, partially because of the geographic proximity. And today, and things go in cycles. And one thing that's been happening in recent years that's quite interesting is as China has gotten to be an economic and military powerhouse and starts flexing its muscle, the Vietnamese are very much interested in rapprochement, closer relations with other countries, and perhaps more than any other, the United States, which is kind of interesting if you think about it.
Now, in one of your stories here, the story the story was called Numbers, about a guy who works for the government. And he has, and if I read the story right, his daughter joined the communists, and there's a little conflict there. But when you were there, were some families, like in the American Civil War, were some families split between, or? Oh,
definitely. And I didn't really get to know families that had that issue, but there were a lot of families that had, relatives in the North who fought on the communist side, the North Vietnamese, and then relatives in the South. So it was a wrenching kind of experience for them. A number of the Vietnamese that I knew in Saigon actually had been born in North Vietnam, but they were Catholics because the French had brought Catholicism into Vietnam when they conquered Vietnam, essentially. And these North Vietnamese, when the French left in 1954, there was a mass exodus of Vietnamese Catholics, particularly, from North Vietnam to South Vietnam, because Ho Chi Minh, as a communist, was not, was in essence, religion was not on his agenda, let's put it that way. And then the man who became the president of South Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem, was a Catholic. So there were a lot of Catholics who had come from North Vietnam to South Vietnam. And it was kind of interesting because they would, have a number of relatives who had stayed behind in the North, and and yes, it was like the American Civil War in that sense. There were families that were on both sides and divided.
Okay. The other thing I noticed in the stories I read, you really incorporate the Vietnamese language, in the way that you don't explain things, but it's obviously they're just talking naturally, and there's a word here and there, so you really get the flavor of, even when they're in America, there's a couple of little scenes and they're talking. Did you end up getting to know Vietnamese pretty well?
Well, not as well as I should have. I mean, I must admit I was a little bit lazy with respect to that, but I'd studied a little Vietnamese before I went over there, and then certainly, in my contact with Vietnamese on a daily basis, picked up more and more, and was able certainly to get around Saigon. But one of the reasons that, as I said, I was perhaps a little lazy is that I knew French, and as I said, a number of the Vietnamese that I got to know had gone to the French school, and many of them spoke English, but some of them did not, and so we would communicate in French, and that was fine, but perhaps if I hadn't known French, I would have had more, I would have pushed myself to to become more conversant in Vietnamese than I.
Well, can you talk? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's
All right. I want to ask you, your book won the Notre Dame Review Book Prize. Could you talk a little bit about what that, how that came about, and many of your stories are published there.
The editor of the Notre Dame Review, William O'Rourke, has been an early and consistent supporter of my writing. He likes the stories that I've written. And so he has accepted now 4 of the stories, I think. One that's actually not in the anthology,
okay.
But was recently published by the Notre Dame Review. And he just decided to honor me with this prize, which was meant for first-time writers, in the sense of writers who had not published a full-length book.
All right, so it's...
So the University of Notre Dame Press has a couple of second book prizes that have been around for quite some time, but not a first book prize. So what he wanted to do is to establish a book prize, and for writers who have published but have not had a book-length manuscript published.
And now that your book is out and award-winning, you were telling me before we started, you're currently working on a novel that takes place in Vietnam in 1969-70, around there. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, this is it's about halfway done, and although I need to go back through it, and it's actually in a prior rendition. It's been completed, but it needs substantial revisions. But this has a number of point of view characters, including an American teacher, including an American correspondent, including a French lawyer, an old French lawyer, including 2 Vietnamese. And the main point of view character, it's called Pale Fate, but the main point of view character is a young Vietnamese woman who is torn between in essence, the communist movement and, shall we say, the South Vietnamese movement, and ultimately is, conflicted, shall we say, in that regard. And then the American teacher gets involved, and I'm not going to give it all away, Joe, because then.
But it takes place during the.
Takes place in 1969 and 1970.
Okay. Now, in this collection here, Love Beneath the Napalm, is there do you have a favorite story or a favorite character?
Well, that's a good question.
Because or do any of these characters recur in any of your other stories?
No, they don't. But the photograph, the first story, actually, is the one that I think moves me the most, and that was published in the Kenyon Review. And in fact, in the book there is a dedication page that has a picture of the young woman who was the subject of that story, the photograph. And she died tragically at a very young age. She was a North Vietnamese cadre who was killed in the process of trying to defuse an unexploded bomb. And when I saw that picture, which came out in, I think, 2002, 2004.
So in this picture, which I'm looking at right now, the picture of the woman playing the guitar,
correct.
She actually, like in the story, was someone who diffused bombs?
Yes.
And then your story is, is...
Well, the story, sort of uses that as a takeoff point.
Okay.
And then I create sort of a fictional account of sort of the grieving process of a fellow soldier who was in love with her, and then at the end of the war, he's not able to move on yet. Let's put it that way.
Well, but that story does take place. It's years later, isn't it?
Well, that story actually would be set in 1975, but the sort of the flashback to
that's right. Okay,
to the 2 flashback scenes that contain the woman with the guitar were in 1970.
Okay, and then I just wanted to ask about this because your other besides being dedicated to the woman in the photograph, your other dedication is to an NBC reporter. Is it Dennis Trout? Dennis Trout, yeah. What was your, I mean, it says here a little thing, but what was your relationship with him?
Well, when I went to Vietnam, it was kind of interesting because I had taken Vietnamese lessons from this woman in Washington, and she had written to her family in Vietnam because I didn't have a place to stay, and she was very nice and said, well, I'll write to my parents. They live in Saigon. You can go stay with them. Don't worry about it. And in fact, when I showed up on their doorstep, they hadn't gotten a letter from their daughter, and they wondered, who the hell is this guy? But they took me in, which was nice. But one of her sisters, my Vietnamese teacher's sisters, had been dating a guy named Bill Dowell, who was an NBC News reporter. So my teacher said, and when you go to Saigon, stay with my family, but be sure you connect with Bill Dowell. So when I got to Saigon, after a couple of days, I got in touch with Bill Dowell, who was a reporter for NBC News. And through him, I managed actually to meet a number of news people in '72 and '73. And one of his fellow NBC News reporters was Dennis Trout, who had, like Bill Dowell, actually served in the U.S. Army and stayed on after their term was over, because NBC would occasionally hire people on as stringers and then reporters. And so I got to know Bill Dowell, Dennis Trout, who were both working for NBC, and Don Critchfield, who was the sort of the bureau chief at NBC at that time, and a few other people. And then that branched out, got to know a German reporter, Dietrich Mumenday, Dennis Neild, who worked for the Associated Press, and some people for CBS. So Dennis and I got to know each other, and he passed away last year at the age of 65. He was still pretty young, but I remember when he sort of took me into his apartment after curfew one night, because I was living a little bit further out in a suburb called Tundin, and I had a motorbike, but I couldn't get home after curfew. So he said, why don't you stay with me? So he had 2 single beds, and so we'd sort of gone to bed, and then in the middle of the night there was this tremendous explosion that actually blew out the windows in his apartment building, including his. And we didn't know what it was, but because he had a Bauchi press pass, he was able to go out, notwithstanding the curfew, try to find out what was going on. And I just stayed there, and later turned out that the North Vietnamese had blown up an oil storage depot about 13 miles away. But if you think about it, they'd blown up 13 miles away, and it was shattering windows in Saigon. So I dedicated the book partially to him as well.
Well, from your 3 years in Vietnam, have you kept in touch with anyone from those years? Or?
Well, I'm still in touch with some very, very close Vietnamese friends that actually were mentors, let's put it this way, in terms of certainly trying to understand the psychology of the Vietnamese. One of whom is in Los Angeles, the other of whom is in France, in Geneva. And so we keep in touch. Okay. And then Dick Hughes, the social worker I work for, we're in touch occasionally. And Bill Dowell and I are Facebook friends, and we exchange emails from time to time. But so yeah.
Oh, very good. Well, a really good, nice collection of stories here. Literary fiction, I guess they call it. Well, good luck with the novel. How long before that's out?
Oh, Joe, it's my copious spare time. That's the problem. I'm up to my ears in alligators, as I like to say. So it's going to be a while yet.
Okay. So, and a really interesting take on the Vietnam War. Some stories, they got a little of everything in them, but it's all from the Vietnamese point of view, I guess you could say. So, love Beneath the Napalm. James Redwood, well, thanks for coming. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Joe. I really appreciate your having me.
Okay, and then we will see you next time on Meet the Author.